It started with a fuel delivery, a harmless legal backup system for winter on my land, built to protect my home. But to the HOA, especially her, Karen, it was a challenge to her control. She didn't just complain, she trespassed. She cut my supply line. And when the blizzard came with temperatures falling below zero, I made a choice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't file another ignored complaint. I walked out into the storm, and I turned the valve. What happened next? Their homes froze, pipes burst, ceilings collapsed, and suddenly the man they tried to silence was the only one who could save them. But I wasn't done teaching them what happens when you push the wrong man too far. Winter had always felt like the only honest season to me. Snow obeyed laws. Cold delivered truth without varnish. If you prepared well, it respected you and moved on. If you didn't, it punished you without malice or apology. The military had drilled that lesson into me long before retirement ever did. Preparation wasn't paranoia. It was reverence for reality. 3 years after leaving the service, I bought a house on the quiet edge of a manicured suburban development. The HOA brochures boasted peaceful, harmonious living, but I never trusted glossy promises. I trusted square footage zoning maps and deed lines. I read the covenants the way other people read novels, slowly, carefully, twice. My lot sat where the road curved and the trees grew thick, giving me fewer neighbors and fewer unsolicited opinions. That margin of solitude was worth more to me than any shared swimming pool or clubhouse. In my first winter here, I installed a supplemental heating system, 2 buried propane tanks, compliant with every county code, fully permitted and inspected, tucked discreetly behind a tall privacy fence. It wasn't about extravagance, it was redundancy. Power outages hit this area hard, and the neighborhood's aging natural gas main laid decades ago fed every house through a single vulnerable artery. Old pipes, old valves, old assumptions. I never trusted assumptions. The tanks were invisible, unless someone deliberately went looking. For 2 winters, no one did. That should have been the end of the story. Then Karen arrived. She didn't move in. She materialized as if the neighborhood had summoned its own enforcer. HOA vice president. Self-appointed guardian of aesthetics and order. The kind of woman who turned a clipboard into a weapon and called it civic pride. Every morning, even when the sidewalks glazed with ice, she marched the streets in pristine boots and a dramatically long scarf, eyes scanning for anything that dared to be different. Not broken, not dangerous, simply not uniform. I first noticed her watching the fuel delivery truck before she noticed me watching her. That was always how people like Karen operated, surveillance disguised as vigilance. The truck stayed less than 20 minutes. The driver logged the fill, capped the tanks, and left. I stood outside in the biting air, watching pale vapor rise from the vents like slow exhalation. It felt solid, reassuring. The forecast had been growling for days about a brutal polar vortex plunging south, sub-zero nights, ice storms, winds that could strip paint. The kind of weather that tested every system and every person in it. That same afternoon, the email landed. Notice of potential HOA violation. No greeting. No context. Just bold red letters and an attachment heavy with righteous indignation. Karen's name sat at the bottom like a brand. She accused me of unauthorized storage of industrial-grade materials, claimed the tanks posed serious aesthetic degradation and undisclosed safety risks, and demanded immediate removal pending full board review. I read it 3 times slowly, letting the words settle. There was no violation. Every permit was attached to my reply, along with inspection reports, IBOMAs, and county sign-offs. I kept the tone clinical, professional. Emotion only feeds bullies. Her response arrived in under 5 minutes. We will conduct an on-site inspection at the board's earliest convenience. Not a question, a decree. The next morning, she appeared with 2 board members trailing behind her like reluctant conscripts. They didn't knock or call ahead. Karen simply strode to my fence line and craned her neck, trying to peer over the top rail. I stepped onto the porch before she could speak. "This is private property," I said, voice level. "You're trespassing." Her smile was thin, practiced. HOA bylaws grant us authority to inspect any exterior element that impacts community safety or appearance. That authority ends at my fence line, I answered. You've been notified in writing. The older board member shifted his white eyes on the frost-covered ground. He knew she was overreaching. They always did. But no one ever stopped her, not until the cost became personal. Karen scribbled something on her clipboard, gave a small nod, as if she'd just scored an invisible point, and turned away. "We'll be in touch," she called over her shoulder. I watched them retreat down the snowy sidewalk, breath clouding in front of me. A heavy certainty settled in my gut, the same pressure I used to feel before a long patrol. A storm was coming, and the people around me had no idea how exposed they truly were. Karen had just declared war on the one neighbor who had actually prepared for winter. She had no idea what winter could do when it finally answered back. The days after Karen's inspection visit passed in a quiet, watchful tension. The neighborhood looked the same: snow-dusted roofs, salt-streaked sidewalks, holiday lights blinking against the early dusk, but I felt the shift like the air itself had grown heavier. The warnings arrived in waves. First came a formal letter from the HOA management company, printed on thick paper with the association's crest embossed at the top. It restated the violation, added a 30-day deadline for removal, and attached a schedule of escalating fines, $100 per day, after the deadline doubling every week. Then came the emails, 3 in 1 week, each more insistent than the last. The subject lines grew louder. Final warning, then imminent enforcement action. Then notice of lien proceedings. I documented everything. Screenshots, timestamps, PDF scans of the printed letters. Backups on 2 separate drives. When you've spent years in environments where small oversights could cost lives, you learn to treat paperwork like armor. I replied once more, attaching the same packet of permits and inspections. This time, I included a polite reminder of state law regarding private utility systems and a reference to the HOA's own bylaws, which explicitly stated that board members could not enter private property without owner consent or a court order. No response came. Then the fuel pressure dropped. It started subtly. The furnace hesitated on startup. The pilot light flickered longer than usual. I checked the gauges at the tanks, still full. I walked the line, eyes scanning for leaks. Nothing obvious. But the irregularity persisted, a faint irregularity in the hiss of gas through the pipes. That night, the temperature plunged faster than the forecast had warned. Wind screamed through the bare trees, rattling windows like someone testing for weak points. I slept lightly attuned to every sound. At 3:17 a.m., the heat shut off completely. I didn't panic. I moved. Flashlight in hand, coat zipped, boots laced. I stepped into the darkness and followed the line to the tanks. The beam caught the damage instantly. A coupling twisted at an unnatural angle, metal scraped and deformed. Fuel had leaked and frozen into a dark, glassy stain on the snow. Not weather damage. Not animal. Deliberate. Sabotage. Anger finally broke through the discipline I'd maintained for weeks. This wasn't about rules or aesthetics anymore. This was personal. Someone had crossed onto my property at night and crippled the one system I relied on to keep my house and myself safe. I photographed everything, close-ups of the twisted fitting, the spill pattern, the footprints, half buried by fresh snow. I pulled the security footage from the cameras mounted under the eaves. At 2:11 a.m., a bundled figure approached along the fence line, slow, deliberate. The long scarf was unmistakable, even in infrared. Karen didn't run. She didn't need to. She believed she was untouchable. I packaged the evidence and sent it to the HOA board, the management company, and the local police non-emergency line. The email was factual, no accusations, just dates, timestamps, photos, and video clips. I asked for an investigation. The reply came from Karen herself, not the board. "This footage is inconclusive," she wrote. "Shadows and weather conditions make identification impossible. Your fuel system remains a documented violation. The board will proceed with enforcement." Inconclusive. The word almost made me laugh, short, bitter, fogging the air in front of me. That afternoon, another fuel truck rolled into the neighborhood, this time stopping at the HOA's communal backup generator near the clubhouse. I watched from my porch as Karen directed the driver, gesturing sharply toward my property more than once. Her voice carried on the wind, confident, commanding. She was stockpiling. She was preparing. And that was when I understood. This had never been about safety or community standards. It was about control. She couldn't tolerate that I had insulated myself against the coming storm while the rest of the neighborhood relied on fragile, centralized systems. She couldn't stand that I didn't need her permission to survive. Later that evening, a neighborhood-wide alert went out. Important notice: potential heating disruptions due to severe weather. Residents are advised to rely on HOA coordinated emergency resources. Individual fuel storage is strongly discouraged. The language was calm, almost caring. But I saw the positioning. She was setting herself up as the gatekeeper, the one who would decide who got warmth when the cold really hit. I walked my property line as dusk settled, checking locks, testing the generator, mentally mapping contingencies. The main gas line ran beneath the road, branching off near my lot before feeding the rest of the development. I'd studied the original blueprints when I bought the house habit from years of assessing terrain and infrastructure. That's when I remembered the valve. An old emergency shutoff installed during construction, sitting squarely within my deeded boundary, forgotten by the HOA. Never reconfigured when the system went automated. Still functional, still mine. I hadn't touched it before. I hadn't needed to. But Karen had changed the equation. As the wind howled louder and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, my phone rang. Not an email this time. "Karen, I think we got off on the wrong foot," she said, her voice suddenly warm, almost conciliatory. "We're all just trying to survive this winter together." I let the silence stretch. "You know," she continued, "if you cooperate, the board might reconsider the fines." Cooperate. I looked out at the darkened street houses glowing faintly behind frost-rimed windows. "I filed a police report," I said. "Someone damaged my fuel system." A sharp intake of breath she couldn't hide. "That's unfortunate. But escalating this won't help anyone." "Neither will intimidation," I replied. She hung up without another word. I stood in the dark, the cold pressing against the windows like a living thing. Karen had made her move. She'd tried to break me quietly, then bully me into submission. She didn't realize she'd just handed me the leverage I needed. Winter wasn't just a season anymore. It was the battlefield. The storm struck 2 days earlier than even the most pessimistic forecasts had predicted. It didn't arrive with thunder or drama. It simply descended heavy, wet snow, driven sideways by a wind that felt like it had come straight from the Arctic. Roads glazed over in hours. Power lines sagged under ice. The world outside my windows turned into a white blur where shapes lost their edges and sound itself seemed muffled. I had been ready for this moment since the night I discovered the sabotage. My generator hummed steadily in the garage, feeding the radiant backup heaters I'd installed years ago. My house stayed warm, quiet, defensible. The rest of the neighborhood was not so fortunate. At 11:47 p.m., with the wind screaming against the siding, I pulled on my heavy parka gloves and headlamp. I trudged through drifting snow to the valve enclosure at the edge of my side yard. The metal box was half buried, but the lock I'd added days earlier held firm. I brushed away the powder, inserted the key, and turned the wheel. 1/4 turn, then another. The old mechanism resisted at first. Decades of disuse had stiffened it, but it gave way with a deep, satisfying groan. Downstream pressure began to bleed off. It would take time for the effects to reach every house, but in this kind of cold time was the one thing no one could afford. I locked the box again, snapped fresh photos with timestamps, and walked back inside. The countdown had started. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay listening to the storm, cataloging every creak of the house, every distant crack of ice-laden branches. At 4:03 a.m., the pounding started. Fists on my front door, hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened the interior door, but kept the storm door locked. Karen stood on the porch, illuminated by my motion light. Her hair was wild beneath a wool hat, her expensive parka dusted white, her face flushed with cold and fury. "My heat just died," she shouted over the wind. "The whole street is losing pressure. I know you did this." I said nothing, letting the howl of the storm fill the space between us. She pressed closer to the glass, breath fogging in frantic bursts. "Pipes are already starting to freeze. This is criminal. You're holding an entire neighborhood hostage because of a petty grudge." I met her eyes. I warned the board. "I sent footage of you tampering with my tanks. You dismissed it. You trespassed. You destroyed my backup." Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across her face. "You can't prove." "I already did," I cut in quietly. "And that valve sits on my deeded property. No easement, no override. You cut me off from my redundancy. I'm under no obligation to subsidize yours." She stared at me, shivering harder now. The anger in her eyes began to fracture, giving way to something rawer. Fear. "There are children out here," she said, voice cracking. "Elderly residents. You're going to let them freeze to punish me." "I'm holding accountable the people who protected the person who endangered me," I replied. "The same people who discouraged every other homeowner from preparing the way I did." She stood there a moment longer, snow collecting on her shoulders, then turned abruptly and disappeared into the blizzard. I closed the door. Within hours, the ripple effects spread. Lights flickered and died across the development as backup generators ran dry or failed in the extreme cold. I watched from an upstairs window as porch lights winked out one by one, leaving the street in near total darkness. The clubhouse glow faded last Karen's showroom of control finally surrendering. By dawn, the neighborhood lay buried and silent under a foot of fresh snow. No plows had reached us yet. No utility trucks. Just white stillness and the faint distant sound of someone trying to start a car that wouldn't turn over. I brewed coffee on my camp stove, savoring the warmth of the mug in my hands. My house was an island of light and heat in a sea of darkness. I knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. At 8:15 a.m., the HOA email chain exploded. Subject: Emergency neighborhood-wide heating failure. Karen's message was no longer imperious. It was almost pleading. Residents are reporting total heat loss across multiple streets. Communal backups have failed. We are investigating causes and coordinating response. Please report your status immediately. 20 minutes later, a second email, this one from her personal account, landed like a desperate counterattack. "It has come to our attention that one homeowner may have deliberately restricted access to critical infrastructure in retaliation for ongoing covenant enforcement. The board is exploring emergency legal options." She was trying to rewrite the story before anyone else could. I stepped outside again, boots crunching through fresh drifts, and cleared snow from the valve enclosure once more. I took new photos, lock intact, no signs of forced entry, GPS timestamp glowing on the screen. Evidence, always evidence. Then I walked to the red survey stake marking my property line and stood there a moment watching smoke, no steam begin to rise faintly from a few rooftops where pipes had already burst. The consequences were arriving right on schedule. And the neighborhood was finally starting to feel how cold the world could get when arrogance met reality. The morning after the shutdown, the neighborhood looked like a frozen photograph, trees bowed under glittering ice roofs, sagging beneath heavy white loads, every breath hanging visible in the air. Beauty on the surface, desperation underneath. I stood at my kitchen window with a fresh mug of coffee watching the first signs of fracture appear. Residents emerged in layers of coats and scarves, shuffling from door to door, knocking, asking questions no one had answers for yet. Their movements were slow, deliberate people conserving energy they weren't sure they could replenish. They were used to thermostats that listened to heat that arrived without thought. Now the cold had reminded them how thin that illusion really was. It didn't take long for eyes to turn toward my house, the only one still exhaling thin plumes of steam from its vents, the only windows not filmed with thick frost on the inside. At 9:02 a.m., a knock came. Not pounding this time, hesitant. I opened the door to find Mr. Lindell, the Vietnam veteran, from down on Willow Court. His cap was pulled low, his cheeks raw from windburn gloved hands rubbing together for warmth. "Morning," he said, voice rough. "Mind if I come in a second just to thaw my fingers?" I stepped aside. He entered gratefully, eyes widening at the steady warmth radiating from the floors. "Whole street's dark," he said, blowing into his hands. "Pipes froze on 3 houses already. Thompson twins are bundled in the minivan with the engine running. And Karen." He paused. Her upstairs bathroom ceiling came down overnight. Water everywhere. I poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped both hands around the mug like it was gold. "I'm not here to accuse you," he continued quietly. "But people are talking. They say you did something to the main line." I pointed out the window toward the red stake in my side yard. "That valve controls the downstream flow to every house past my lot. It's on my land. No easement recorded. I closed it after someone sabotaged my tanks." He followed my gaze, understanding dawning. "Karen," he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He nodded slowly. "She's been running this place like her personal kingdom for years. We let her. Thought it kept things orderly." He sipped the coffee, eyes distant. "Order doesn't mean much when your grandkids are shivering." He finished the drink, set the mug down gently. "I'll talk to a few others, the ones who still think for themselves. By noon, the street had turned into a makeshift survival camp. Generators growled in driveways, extension cords snaked across sidewalks like orange lifelines, propane heaters hissed on porches. Children's muffled cries carried on the wind. Someone had dragged a camp stove into the middle of the cul-de-sac and was boiling water for instant soup. The clubhouse doors stayed locked, its generator dead, its roof visibly sagging. Karen's SUV remained in her driveway, buried to the wheel wells. No lights, no movement. Word spread quietly that she'd slipped out the back during the night, maybe to a hotel, maybe to family. No one had seen her since her confrontation at my door. Then came the bulletin from Greg, the HOA president, sent from his phone battery dying. Urgent community infrastructure coordination. The tone had changed completely. Due to systemic failures beyond our control, the board acknowledges that past guidance on winter preparation may have been inadequate. We urgently request any resident with knowledge of infrastructure access points to contact us immediately so heat can be restored. They still couldn't say it outright. But everyone understood what they were asking. I walked back out to the valve enclosure, cleared the fresh drift that had piled against it overnight, and checked the lock again. Intact. Untouched. I took more photos, added them to the growing folder on my desktop labeled simply Evidence. Inside that folder sat everything. Property surveys proving the valve's location, expired easement clauses, state utility codes, the sabotage footage, police report number, timestamps of every ignored warning. I drafted a new email, this one addressed to the entire board, CC'd to the city's Public Utilities Office and Department of Housing. It was short. I am not your contingency plan. You chose to protect the person who trespassed and destroyed my private fuel system instead of investigating my complaint. The valve remains closed until accountability arrives. I hit send at 1:17 p.m. The first real plea came just before 2. Greg himself appeared at my gate, face flushed from cold, clutching a clipboard that looked absurd in the circumstances. "Mr. Hayes," he called, voice cracking. "Can we talk?" I stepped onto the porch. He approached, slowly, boots crunching. "I read your email. We saw the footage. All of it." I waited. "Karen acted alone," he said. "No board vote, no consensus. Some of us suspected she was going too far, but," he shrugged helplessly, "she steamrolled everything. We were cowards." "That's not my concern," I said. He nodded, eyes on the snow. "My kids are sleeping in the living room with space heaters. My mother-in-law's hands are blue. I know you have every right to leave that valve closed, but I'm asking, begging if there's any way." He trailed off. I studied him for a long moment. The man who had signed every fine notice now stood humbled by the weather he'd never prepared for. "Why didn't any of you stop her sooner?" I asked. "Because it was easier to let her be the bad guy," he admitted. "Until the bad guy turned on all of us." I didn't respond immediately. In the distance, I heard an engine, struggling to turn over a child crying. "I'm not reopening it yet," I said finally. "Not until the city confirms I'm within my rights, and until Karen is off the board." He swallowed hard. "We can call an emergency vote." "Then do it." He nodded, turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. We all are. Sorry didn't warm pipes, but it was a start." As he trudged away, I noticed a small figure making her way across the street, a teenage girl, scarf wrapped tight, carrying something bundled in her arms. She stopped at the edge of my walkway. "My grandma's fingers are numb," she said, voice trembling. "We don't have a generator. Do you have anything? A heater, anything?" I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't part of the board. She hadn't ignored my warnings. She was just a kid caught in a storm adults had created. "Wait here." I went to the garage and returned with a portable radiant heater and a high-capacity power bank. "Small room," I told her. "Close the door, conserve the battery." Her eyes filled. "Thank you." As she hurried away, she glanced back. "Are you really the one who shut it off?" I exhaled slowly. "I'm the one who finally made people listen." She nodded as if that made perfect sense and disappeared into the white. I stood there a long time watching steam rise from a few more rooftops as more pipes gave way. The neighborhood was breaking, but something else was forming in its place, something harder, truer, and I wasn't done teaching yet. The second day of the freeze dragged on like a slow hemorrhage. The temperature never climbed above 0. Wind chill plunged it into the negative teens. Snowdrifts blocked half the driveways, and every exhaled breath crystallized instantly in the air. The neighborhood had become a grid of quiet desperation. Generators coughing themselves, hoarse power cords frozen stiff across sidewalks. Families huddled in single rooms around whatever heat source they could scrounge. And still, my house remained the only steady beacon of warmth on the block. I spent the morning checking my own system's fuel levels, battery banks, ventilation, then stepped outside to clear the walkway again. The valve enclosure stood untouched under its fresh cap of snow, the lock gleaming like a small, defiant eye. I brushed it clean, took another set of time-stamped photos out of habit, and listened to the neighborhood sounds, a baby crying somewhere down the street, the metallic clank of someone trying to thaw a frozen pipe with a hairdryer, the low murmur of voices gathering in clusters. At 10:12 a.m., a black city SUV with tire chains crept down the road hazard lights, blinking through the blowing snow. It stopped first at Karen's house, no answer, then continued to mine. 2 officials climbed out. The woman I recognized, Ellen Reese, field investigator from Public Utilities, the same one who'd handled a minor zoning question for me years ago. Her companion wore the dark blue jacket of housing compliance. "Mr. Hayes," Ellen greeted, pulling her hood down. Snowflakes melted instantly on her glasses. "We've received a flood of calls about restricted access to a legacy heating junction." I nodded once. "It's on my property. No recorded easement. I reported vandalism to my private system days ago. Ignored." She glanced at her partner, then back at me. "We're not here to compel access, just to document and assess public safety risk." I handed over the thick packet I'd prepared the night before: surveys, deeds, utility overlays, sabotage photos, police report, the entire email trail. She flipped through it efficiently, eyebrows rising at the infrared still of Karen at my tanks. "This is thorough," she said. "We'll need a statement from you confirming no immediate life-threatening danger stemming from the valve closure." "I've distributed heaters and power banks to vulnerable neighbors," I said, gesturing toward the street where the teenage girl's tracks were still visible. "I'm not trying to harm anyone. I'm protecting what's mine after the association failed to protect me." Ellen nodded. "That matches resident reports. Some mentioned you've been more helpful than the board." She lowered her voice. "Off record, the citation Karen issued, she used a fabricated ordinance number. We're opening a separate fraud inquiry." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't realized was there. As they turned to leave, she added quietly, "You're within your rights, Mr. Hayes. No easement, no override. Just try to keep helping where you can. The roads won't be clear for another day, at least." I watched the SUV crawl away, then went back inside. An hour later, Greg called again, voice hoarse over a dying phone battery. "The city stopped by," he asked without preamble. "They did. And they confirmed I'm legally entitled to keep the valve closed." Silence stretched on the line, broken only by faint children's voices in the background. "We held the emergency vote," he said finally. "Unanimous. Karen is removed from the board permanently. We're drafting a public acknowledgement of the sabotage and withdrawing all fines against you." I waited. "I know it's not enough," he went on, "but it's what we can do right now. People are scared, Hayes. They're looking at you as the only one who saw this coming. If you could open the line, even partially." "Not yet," I said. "Not until the city finishes documenting everything and the neighborhood understands exactly why this happened." He exhaled shakily. "Fair enough. We'll send the removal notice neighborhood-wide this afternoon." The call ended. I stood at the window watching more steam plumes rise as additional pipes surrendered to the cold. A young couple pushed a stroller down the middle of the street, heading toward a relative's house with working heat. Mr. Lindell and 2 other men were digging out an elderly woman's driveway, their breaths puffing in unison. Then came the sound I'd been half expecting all day. A sharp hollow crack from the direction of Karen's house, followed by a deep groan of timber. Burst pipes finally claiming the upper floor. I pulled on my coat without thinking. The street was empty enough that every footstep echoed. Karen's porch light flickered weakly. The front door was unlocked. I knocked hard. No answer. I pushed inside. The air hit me first, damp, frigid smelling of wet insulation and ruined plaster. Water dripped steadily from the kitchen ceiling. A large section of sheetrock had collapsed onto the island, exposing fractured pipes still weeping. Karen sat on the floor, in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in a soaked blanket. Her trademark scarf hung limp around her neck. Her face was pale lips, tinged blue eyes swollen and vacant. She looked up as I entered. "I didn't think it would get this bad," she whispered, voice raw. I didn't reply immediately. I crossed to the thermostat, 36 degrees and falling. I called for help, she mumbled. No one came. I knelt, opened the emergency kit I'd grabbed. On instinct, Chemical Warmer's Mylar blanket, a small thermos of broth I'd kept hot on the stove. She stared at the items as if they were foreign objects. I did it, she said suddenly. The tanks. I twisted the coupling. I thought if I forced you to remove them, everything would go back to looking perfect. A shudder ran through her. My mother died in this house. I thought if I kept it perfect, she'd still be here somehow. The confession hung in the freezing air. I handed her the thermos. She took it with trembling hands. You need to get out of here, I said. The structure's compromised. More could come down. She nodded numbly. Then quieter. If you want to turn me in, I understand. Can I warm up at your place just until the storm breaks? I looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had tried to strip away my security, now stripped of every defense. I extended my hand. She took it. We walked back through the silent, snow-choked street together, her arm looped through mine for balance, both of us leaving footprints side by side in the fresh powder. When I opened my door and the wave of warmth rolled over her, she swayed, then sank onto the couch without a word. I draped dry blankets around her, set a mug of tea within reach. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her. She slept curled toward the heat vent, like someone afraid it might vanish. Outside, the storm still raged. Inside, the silence felt different, fragile, but no longer hostile. The neighborhood remained cold, but for the first time, someone who had helped make it that way was finally feeling the full weight of the freeze. Sunrise on the third day brought no warmth, only a pale, washed-out light that made the ice-coated neighborhood look even more desolate. The storm had finally eased, but the cold dug in deeper, as if determined to finish what it started. Drifts piled against doors like silent barricades. Rooftops glittered with a cruel beauty, every shingle encased in glass like frost. Karen was still asleep on my couch when I stepped outside at dawn to shovel the front path, not for comfort, but for access. Paramedics or city crews would need a clear route soon. The air stung my lungs sharp enough to make my eyes water. I worked methodically, the scrape of the shovel the only sound breaking the stillness. By 8 o'clock, Greg called again. We sent the removal notice, he said without greeting. His voice sounded scraped raw. Karen's officially off the board. We also attached a statement admitting the sabotage complaint was mishandled. People are reading it. I paused mid-shovel, and they're angry. Not at you anymore. At us. At her. At themselves for going along. A long breath. The city's coming back today. Ellen Reese said they want to meet with you and with me. Together. I resumed shoveling. Good. Haze. The clubhouse roof partially collapsed last night. Another pipe burst. It's condemned until inspection. We have nowhere to hold meetings. He hesitated. People want to hear from you. Directly. They're saying you're the only one who told the truth from the beginning. I stopped and looked down the street. Small groups of neighbors were already gathering in driveways, sharing coffee from thermoses, comparing damaged voices low but urgent. Tell them 3 o'clock, I said. Here. Outside my house. Bring coats. You're sure? I'm sure. I spent the next hours preparing. I shoveled a wide semicircle in the front yard, big enough for 50 or 60 people to stand without crowding. I dragged out 2 portable radiant heaters and every solar blanket I owned from my deployment stash, silver crinkly but effective. I set up a folding table with a thermos of hot water and packets of instant cocoa. Not charity, just practical. Karen woke around noon. She sat up slowly, hair-tangled eyes, puffy from crying and cold. She looked smaller without her clipboard and scarf armor. I heard you on the phone, she said quietly. I nodded. They kicked me off the board. They did. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I saw the email. Everyone did. A bitter laugh escaped her. My inbox is full. I poured her coffee. She took it with both hands. I'm listing the house, she said, as soon as the road's clear. I called a realtor yesterday from your landline. I didn't respond. I don't expect forgiveness, she went on. I just needed you to know I'm leaving. I can't stay here after what I did. She stood, folded the blankets neatly, and set the mug in the sink. At the door, she paused. Thank you for pulling me out of that house. I would have frozen in there. Then she was gone, walking slowly down the cleared path toward the street, head down against the wind. By 2:45 p.m., they began arriving. First, Mr. Lindell and the Thompsons with their twins bundled like little snowmen. Then more 20, 30, 50, close to 70 in the end. They formed a loose semicircle in the space I'd cleared, stomping feet to stay warm, breath rising in collective clouds. Faces I recognized from years of distant waves now looked at me openly, some wary, some grateful, all exhausted. Greg stood at the front with two other former board members looking like men waiting for judgment. I stepped forward onto the porch step so everyone could see me. The valve enclosure was only a few feet behind me, half visible under its thin blanket of snow. "You all know why we're here," I began, voice carrying in the cold stillness. This storm didn't just bring snow. It exposed every weakness we ignored. No one interrupted. The HOA spent years discouraging independent preparation, fining people for generators, banning visible fuel storage for aesthetics. When I reported sabotage to my tanks, clear evidence on camera, the board protected the person responsible instead of investigating. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward Greg and the others. That valve behind me, I continued pointing, controls the gas flow to every house downstream of my property. It sits on my land, no easement. When my backup was destroyed and my warnings ignored, I closed it. Not to punish innocent people, but to force accountability. A few nods. More murmurs, louder now. "I would do it again," I said firmly. "Because no one should be allowed to endanger a neighbor and face zero consequences." The crowd went quiet. Even the wind seemed to still. But I also shared what I had. I went on softer. Heaters, power banks, shelter when it was needed. Because neighbors aren't supposed to control each other. We're supposed to help each other survive. Mr. Lindell stepped forward. "You were right the whole time. We should have listened." Others echoed him, quiet agreements, a few quiet apologies. I walked to the valve box, brushed away the snow, and inserted the key. "I'm reopening the line now," I said. Not because anyone forced me, because I believe this neighborhood has finally learned the cost of ignoring the truth. I turned the wheel slowly, quarter turn, half full, open. The faint hiss of pressure returning was lost in the wind, but everyone knew what it meant. A ripple of relief moved through the crowd. Some clapped gloved hands, others wiped at their eyes. Not triumph, just gratitude. Greg cleared his throat. "We're scheduling a full audit of HOA operations. New elections this spring. Anyone can run. And we're striking every rule that ever discouraged emergency preparedness." He looked at me. "We hoped you might consider." I shook my head. "I didn't do this to take your job. I did it to live without fear of people like the old board." They understood. As the crowd began to disperse, slowly talking among themselves for the first time in days, I noticed the city trucks finally rolling down the streetlights, flashing crews ready to assess damage and restore full service. Heat would return soon, but the real thaw had already begun. The city crews arrived in force the day after I reopened the valve. Salt trucks growled down the streets, plows scraping ice into ragged piles along the curbs. Utility vans parked in clusters, workers in hard hats threading new temporary lines and assessing burst pipes. The neighborhood hummed with the sound of recovery hammers on frozen fittings, generators winding down as grid power flickered back to life. But the real reckoning was happening on paper. Mid-morning, a silver sedan with municipal plates pulled up in front of my house. Ellen Reese stepped out first, followed by Jason Kwan, the lead investigator from Housing Compliance. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had seen too many disasters and knew exactly which questions to ask. I invited them inside. The living room still smelled faintly of the pine soap I'd used to mop up melted snow from Karen's soaked boots the night before. I laid out the full binder on the coffee table, every document, photo, and email now supplemented with the time-stamped images of the valve reopening. Jason reviewed it all in silence, occasionally jotting notes. When he finished, he leaned back and met my eyes. "This is one of the most complete homeowner defense files I've ever seen," he said. "Military background." I nodded once. "That explains it." He tapped the binder. "We've confirmed 3 violations by the HOA. First issuance of a citation based on a fabricated ordinance. Karen admitted as much in her preliminary statement to Ellen yesterday." Ellen added she came to the field office voluntarily, waived counsel for now, said she wanted to get it over with. I raised an eyebrow. She confessed. "Fully," Jason confirmed. "Trespass, vandalism of private utility, infrastructure, falsification of official HOA documents. Those alone carry potential criminal charges." Add the negligence angle actively discouraging resident preparedness in violation of state winter safety advisories, and the board's liability grows. He paused. We're recommending suspension of all HOA enforcement powers for 90 days minimum. Possible dissolution if the audit uncovers more systemic issues. Ellen leaned forward. The valve itself is unequivocally yours. No easement, no public right-of-way. You had and still have full legal authority over it. The city will put that in writing today. A weight I hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from my shoulders. What happens to Karen, I asked. Separate process, Jason replied. Likely restitution to you for the damaged fuel system plus whatever the DA decides on charges. She's already agreed to cover emergency repairs for affected residents out of pocket selling the house to fund it. I exhaled slowly. Just as slow and methodical, but arriving all the same. They left with copies of everything promising a formal report within the week. Outside the street was transforming. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now stood in small groups, sharing stories of the Freeze laughing nervously at close calls offering help with cleanup. Kids built lopsided snowmen in yards that hours ago had been emergency camps. Someone fired up a grill, and the smell of cooking hamburgers drifted on the warming air. Mr. Lindell stopped by in the afternoon carrying a thermos of fresh coffee as thanks. Heard the city's tearing the HOA apart, he said with a wry smile. Suspending it at least. Good. Past time. He glanced toward Karen's house windows boarded a for sale sign already staked crookedly in the snowbank. She left this morning. Moving truck came at dawn. Didn't say goodbye to anyone. I nodded. I'd watched from the window as the truck pulled away Karen in the passenger seat of a friend's car, behind it face turned away from the neighborhood she'd tried to control. She needed to go, Lindell said quietly. But I reckon this place is better for what she forced us to face. He clapped me on the shoulder and left. By evening, power was fully restored. Furnaces hummed back to life across the development. Steam no longer rose from burst pipes, it rose from vents as homes finally warmed. Lights glowed in every window, steady and reliable. I sat on my back porch as dusk settled watching the last of the snow slide from the roof in heavy clumps. The cold still lingered, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a teacher that had finished its lesson. The neighborhood had survived not because of the HOA, but in spite of it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider on the edge. I felt like the one who had helped draw the line between fear and preparedness and shown everyone which side was safer to stand on. The thaw was more than temperature. It was trust slowly rebuilding itself, one repaired pipe, one shared story, one quiet nod at a time. Spring arrived cautiously, as if testing whether the neighborhood deserved it. The snow retreated in uneven patches, revealing lawns pocked with frost heave and driveways stained from burst pipes. Split tree limbs hung like broken bones over sidewalks. Basements still hummed with dehumidifiers. Yet beneath the scars, something new was taking root. People waved when I passed real waves, not the cursory lift of a hand they'd offered before. Some stopped to talk. A few even dropped off small thank yous, a six-pack of good beer, a plate of cookies, a borrowed tool, returned with a note that read, "No rush, whenever you need it back." I didn't keep score. I just accepted, nodded, and felt the slow shift from isolation to something closer to belonging. The HOA officially dissolved 6 weeks after the storm. The city's final report cited systemic negligence and abuse of authority. Enforcement powers were revoked indefinitely. An interim liaison, someone from 2 towns over, was appointed to handle basic maintenance until residents decided what came next. Most of the old board resigned quietly. Greg lasted longest, then sent a neighborhood-wide letter full of careful phrases, missteps in oversight, lessons learned, commitment to transparency, moving forward. He never mentioned Karen by name. She had vanished 3 days after our last conversation in my kitchen. I'd watched from the window as the moving truck backed into her driveway at first light. Movers in coveralls carried out furniture wrapped in blankets boxes labeled in her precise handwriting. She rode away in the passenger seat of a silver sedan driven by someone I didn't recognize, staring straight ahead, scarf nowhere in sight. I didn't feel triumph. I felt only a quiet, hollow relief, like closing a chapter I hadn't realized was still draining me. One warm Saturday in April, Mr. Lindell knocked on my door. He wasn't alone. Behind him, stood 8 or 9 neighbors, some I knew by name, others only by sight, holding coffee cups and looking slightly sheepish. "We've been meeting informally," he said, stepping inside when I waved them in. "About the future. No clipboards this time." They spread out in my living room, careful not to crowd. Someone had brought donuts. The conversation started slow talk of cleanup costs, insurance battles, the clubhouse demolition, but quickly turned to what should replace the old HOA. "We want something lighter," Lindell said. "Voluntary dues for shared stuff, snow plowing, maybe a community garden, open books, no fines for being human." A younger father, the one with the twins, added, "And rules that actually help us survive, not just look pretty." They all turned to me. "We'd like you on the steering committee," Lindell said. "Not to run it just to help us build it right. You've earned that seat more than anyone." I started to refuse out of reflex. Leadership had never been my goal. I'd bought this house for distance, for self-reliance. But I looked around the room at faces no longer averted, at people who now understood the difference between control and community, and felt something shift inside me. "I won't chair it," I said finally. "But I'll come to meetings, advise. Make sure we never discourage preparation again." Relief broke across their faces. Lindell grinned. "That's more than we hoped for." They left an hour later, plans already forming, laughter echoing down my walkway for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, I walked to the side yard where the old valve box sat. Grass had begun to creep over the metal lid. Weeds poked through the gravel. It looked almost ordinary now, another forgotten relic of the development's early days. I knelt, brushed dirt from the edges, and considered burying it entirely, but I didn't. Instead, I left it exposed, not as a threat, as a reminder. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a cold beer, watching fireflies blink on in the cooling dusk. The sky was clear stars, sharp overhead. Somewhere down the block, kids laughed as they rode bikes until streetlights flickered on. A neighbor's grill sizzled. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Winter would return, of course. It always did. But next time, every house on the street would have a generator or propane tanks or wood stoves, no longer hidden in shame but standing ready. Next time, warnings would be heeded. Next time, no one would wield rules like weapons. I took a long drink and leaned back in my chair. For the first time since retiring, I didn't feel like a stranger on the edge of someone else's community. I felt like the foundation it had needed all along. Home wasn't the house I'd bought for solitude. It was the quiet knowledge that the people around me finally understood what survival and neighborliness really meant. And that, more than any valve, or tank, or permit, was the warmth that would carry us through whatever came next. The official letter from the city arrived in late May, thick cream-colored envelope, with the municipal seal embossed in the corner. I opened it on the porch while the morning sun warmed the boards under my feet for the first time all year. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a formal finding that the neighborhood HOA had engaged in multiple instances of negligent governance, fraudulent enforcement, and failure to uphold resident safety. All fines ever issued to me were voided with instructions for immediate refund of any payments there had been, none I'd never paid. The second page carried the heavier weight recommendation for permanent dissolution of the existing association and transfer of common assets to a new resident-led entity. I folded the papers, slipped them back into the envelope, and left them on the kitchen counter. Vindication on paper felt anticlimactic after surviving the real thing. That same week, the clubhouse was demolished. I watched from my driveway as a backhoe took its first bite out of the sagging roof. Dust rose in slow clouds, catching the light like pale smoke. The building had been condemned since the storm pipes burst, trusses cracked mold, spreading faster than anyone could mitigate. By noon, only a pile of splintered beams and broken brick remained. Children from the block gathered at a safe distance, wide-eyed, as if watching the last monument to the old regime fall. No one mourned it. In its place, plans were already circulating for something simpler, a covered pavilion, a community tool library, maybe a shared emergency supply cache. Ideas born in living rooms and driveways, not boardrooms. Karen's house sold quickly. A young couple from out of state bought it sight unseen, drawn by the low price, and the agent's carefully worded, motivated seller. On closing day, I saw the moving truck arrive again, this time, unloading rather than loading. New furniture, bright colors, children's bikes strapped to the roof rack. They waved as they carried boxes inside. I waved back. Life moving forward. One evening in early June, Mr. Lindell and 3 others showed up with a folder of bylaws they'd drafted together. Simple, transparent, voluntary. They spread the pages across my kitchen table. We kept it to 10 pages, Lindell said with a grin. Figured shorter was safer. I read through it slowly. No aesthetic police. No bans on generators or fuel storage. A clause requiring any emergency preparedness rule changes to be approved by open vote. Another mandating public disclosure of all complaints and investigations. It was everything the old HOA had never been. At the bottom of the last page was a blank line for founding committee signatures. They'd already signed 9 names, including Greg's, surprisingly. The 10th line waited for me. I picked up the pen. Not as chair, I reminded them. Lindell laughed. We know. Advisor, voice of reason. The guy who makes sure we never forget what happens when we let fear write the rules. I signed. That night, I walked the neighborhood after dark, something I hadn't done in years. Porches were lit. People sat outside talking in low voices over glasses of wine or lemonade. Generators hummed softly behind a few houses, no longer hidden but serviced and ready. Propane tanks stood neatly beside sheds painted to match siding or screened with lattice, but visible. Owned. A few residents nodded as passed. One called out evening haze. Another raised a glass in quiet salute. I nodded back, hands in my pockets, feeling the warm air on my skin. The valve box in my side yard had finally disappeared under new sod I'd laid in May. Grass grew thick and green over it now. I'd left the key on a hook in the garage, not buried, not destroyed, just retired. Winter would come again, relentless as ever. But this time, the neighborhood would meet it with eyes open, systems redundant, and doors that stayed unlocked for anyone who needed shelter. I had come here seeking distance from people. Instead, I'd found the rarest kind of proximity neighbors who understood that true community isn't built on matching mailboxes or perfect lawns. It's built on the shared knowledge that when the cold arrives, no one gets left outside. And for the first time in my life, military towns deployments, transient apartments, and this quiet edge lot, I finally felt rooted. Not because I'd won a fight, but because the fight had taught us all how to stand together when the next one came. Years later, when newcomers asked how the neighborhood had earned its reputation for being the most prepared in the county, the story always circled back to that one brutal winter, the storm that didn't just bury us in snow, but unearthed everything we'd been hiding beneath rules and resentment. By then, the community had a name for itself: Edgewood Cooperative. No heavy-handed board, no endless covenants. Just a simple charter we'd all signed, framed and hanging in the new pavilion where the clubhouse once stood. Annual dues were voluntary, spent only on things we voted for: shared plows, a stocked emergency shed, regular drills no one mocked anymore. I never took a title. I didn't need one. I showed up to meetings when invited, offered input, when asked, and otherwise tended my own corner of the world. The valve box had long since vanished under a raised garden bed, tomatoes in summer, kale in fall. The key still hung in the garage, gathering dust beside old deployment gear I no longer needed to keep close. Children who had been toddlers during the freeze now rode bikes past my house without a second thought, calling me Mr. Hayes, or sometimes just Hayes when they got older and bolder. They grew up hearing versions of the story from their parents, how one man's stubborn preparation became everyone's lifeline, how a single act of sabotage forced an entire community to grow up overnight. Some versions painted me as the hero. Others, more honest, remembered the nights houses went dark and pipes screamed as they split. All of them ended the same way we learned. Karen's name rarely came up anymore. The young couple who bought her house turned it into something bright and loud, music drifting from open windows in summer holiday lights that actually stayed up past January. They never knew the full history, and no one felt the need to tell them. Some ghosts are better left to thaw on their own. Mr. Lindell has passed a few winters later, peacefully in his sleep. At his memorial, in the pavilion, people told stories not of wars he'd fought overseas, but of the quiet courage he'd shown that February, knocking on doors with coffee, digging out strangers, speaking up when it mattered most. They unveiled a small plaque on the emergency shed, in memory of Harold Lindell, neighbor, veteran, voice of reason. I stood in the back that day, hands in my coat pockets, feeling the bite of a familiar wind. Winter again. But the shed was stocked, the plows contracted, every house glowing warm behind me. After the ceremony, a girl no older than 15, the same one who'd come begging for a heater years ago, approached me. "You still keep that valve key?" she asked, half teasing. I smiled. "Somewhere." "Good," she said, "just in case we ever forget." "We won't," I thought. "Not this place, not anymore." That night, I sat on the porch as the first snow of the season began to fall, light, almost playful flakes drifting through the streetlights. Houses up and down the block stood ready, generators, tested tanks, filled storm kits by every door. No one hid them now. Preparedness wasn't rebellion here. It was tradition. I watched the snow settle on the garden bed, where the valve lay buried on the pavilion roof on the plaque bearing Lindell's name. The neighborhood looked peaceful, ordinary. But I knew better. We were stronger than we looked, forged in a cold that had tried to break us, and found instead that we bent only far enough to learn how to stand straighter. Winter had always been my season. Now it belonged to all of us. And for the first time in my life, I didn't watch the snow alone. I watched it with people who finally understood its language, and who had learned alongside me how to answer back.